My name is Ariana Blake, and on my 36th birthday I found out how cruel people can be when they think you will never fight back. It happened at a seafood restaurant near the San Diego harbor, and I remember the weather being soft and quiet as if the wind itself had no idea what was about to unfold. I sat at the table with my daughter beside me and my family across from me, smiling, sipping wine, pretending they cared, while something inside me already knew this wasn't a celebration. I blew out the tiny candle the waiter brought over, barely touching the dessert, and just as I sat back in my chair to breathe, my sister's son came running toward me like he had been waiting for a cue. He snatched my purse off the back of my chair and sprinted toward the water, his shoes slapping against the wooden deck. I stood up instinctively thinking he was just being clumsy, but he stopped right at the edge, turned, looked me in the eye, and shouted in a clear voice that cut across the quiet evening air, "Dad says you don't deserve nice things," and with that he threw my purse into the water behind him. I heard laughter, sharp, mocking adult laughter, and it came not from him but from the table where my sister Simone and her husband Logan sat sipping their drinks. They laughed like it was all part of a joke, like I was supposed to find it funny, like it hadn't been my belongings, my dignity, and my daughter watching it all unfold. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I just turned to Riley, took her hand, and walked away while their voices followed me, echoing louder than the wind. They thought I would go home and cry. They thought I would do what I always did, shrink, disappear, apologize for making things uncomfortable. But something inside me had shifted without warning that night. As soon as I got home, I opened my banking app, stared at the list of auto payments I had been making month after month, and started canceling them one by one without hesitation. Car insurance for Simone's vehicle gone, rent assistance for their apartment deleted, tuition payments for the after-school program wiped clean. By 9:05 the next morning, Simone's car had already been towed, and that was only the beginning. As Riley and I sat in the living room, I felt something that I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not guilt, not even anger, but a quiet certainty that I had carried this burden for too long, and it was finally time to set it down. I looked at my daughter, who had been watching me since we walked out of that restaurant, her eyes wide but calm. She didn't ask questions, but she didn't need to. The silence between us was full of everything I had never said, the years I had spent putting out fires, cleaning up messes, fixing problems that weren't mine to fix. I had always been the one who held everything together, the dependable sister, the responsible daughter, the reliable aunt, and I did it because someone had to, because chaos was always swirling around Simone and Logan, and someone needed to shield Riley from it all. But being dependable had turned into being taken for granted, and that moment at the harbor was not just about a purse, it was about years of being the one who never said no. It was about the bills I paid, the emergencies I handled, the way Logan looked at me like I owed them something every time they showed up late or broke or desperate and somehow still entitled. I thought about Simone's face at dinner, how she avoided looking at me when her son made that cruel little announcement, how Logan smirked like he had been waiting to see what I would do, like he enjoyed watching me stay quiet. I thought about my parents too, how they watched it all happen and said nothing, not even a word to the child who had just tossed my purse into the ocean. It was like they were used to this, like they had decided long ago that peace was more important than fairness, that keeping the family together meant ignoring disrespect if it was loud enough and directed at me. But what they didn't see was that I wasn't going to bend anymore. I wasn't going to stay quiet just to keep the peace for people who didn't offer me the same. I had supported Simone and Logan for years, paid their overdue rent, covered their utilities, even paid for that fancy after-school program because Simone said her son needed structure, even though the same kid just destroyed my belongings and humiliated me in public, and no one had the decency to say sorry. Every time I helped, I told myself it was temporary, that one day they would get it together, that they would be grateful, but the truth was they got used to it. They built their lives around my support and laughed when I finally reached my limit. That night after Riley went to bed, I stood in the kitchen staring at the dark window, my reflection barely visible but solid enough to remind me that I existed too. I wasn't just a backup plan or a safety net or a silent witness to their selfishness. I was a mother, a woman, a person who had built a life that worked even when theirs didn't, and I didn't owe them anything, not anymore. I replayed that dinner in my mind, not the big moment but the small one, Simone's fidgeting, Logan's smug grin, my parents' silence, the way Riley sat still clutching her napkin pretending not to hear what had been said. Those moments haunted me more than the splash of my purse hitting the water, because they revealed everything that had been broken long before that dinner. I had trained everyone to treat me like a resource, and I was done with that role. No more automatic payments, no more last-minute bailouts, no more pretending things were okay when they weren't. The next morning, when the texts started flooding in, I didn't answer. When the voicemails piled up, I didn't listen. When the excuses started arriving, framed as confusion, as shock, as outrage, I just let them fall silent, unread, unanswered. I was no longer interested in their emergencies, especially the ones they created themselves. I had finally chosen myself, not out of revenge, but out of necessity, and that felt like the strongest birthday gift I had ever given myself. And in the middle of that quiet, I felt my first real breath in years, one that wasn't caught in my throat or waiting to be interrupted, one that belonged only to me and to the life I was finally claiming on my own terms. That night after Riley had gone to her room without saying much, I stood alone in the kitchen with the faint hum of the refrigerator as the only sound around me. The darkness outside pressed against the window like it was waiting for me to make a decision. The weight of all those years of helping Simone and Logan sat heavy on my chest, and I realized I had never paused long enough to ask why I kept doing it. Maybe I believed if I kept the chaos under control no one would fall apart. Maybe I thought if I held everything together they would eventually grow up and stop needing me, but that never happened. Instead, the requests kept coming, the emergencies became more frequent, and my silence was taken as agreement. And each time I told myself it would be the last time I paid the rent or covered the car note or helped with the utility bill, but that last time never arrived. It just became a cycle, one that stole from me quietly while they laughed like nothing mattered. And that birthday dinner showed me exactly where I stood. I thought about how Logan always had that same look on his face when he got what he wanted, like charm made up for everything he never took responsibility for, and Simone followed right behind him, eyes wide, voice soft, spinning excuses that sounded like emergencies but were just the result of avoiding adulthood. I saw it clearly now. They never wanted to fix anything, they just wanted someone to absorb the damage. And I had let it be me for too long. I stood in that kitchen, staring at my reflection in the glass, and realized how small I had let myself become just to keep things peaceful. But there was nothing peaceful about being used, nothing calm about being laughed at by people who had no idea what it meant to carry the weight of everyone else's mistakes. I thought about Riley sitting at that table watching her cousin humiliate me while the adults around her said nothing, and I realized I had been teaching her something without meaning to. I had been showing her that love meant sacrificing your dignity, that family meant tolerating disrespect, that being kind meant letting people walk all over you, and I could not let that be the version of adulthood she learned from me. Not anymore. I had to show her something different. I had to show her that strength was not measured by how much you could take, but by when you chose to stop taking it. And that night I chose to stop. I opened my laptop and logged into every account I had used to support them, the rent, the car, the after-school program. I canceled everything, every transaction, every reminder, every automatic draft gone. It was like peeling layers off my skin, but each cancellation made it easier to breathe. I did not hesitate, I did not second guess. It felt like I was unhooking chains I had been dragging for years, and once I was done I closed the laptop and let the silence wrap around me like armor. The next morning came too fast and the sun felt too bright, but I moved through the house like I was walking through a dream. Riley was quiet, but her eyes kept following me like she could sense something had changed. I didn't say anything. I just made breakfast and waited for the first phone call. It came at 8:15. Logan, of course, short, direct, urgent. I didn't answer. Then Simone tried 2 minutes later, her tone different but still carrying that edge of panic that told me they knew something had shifted. I let it ring. The messages followed fast, one after another. Words like "what's going on" and "there must be some mistake" and "please call me back" stacked on top of each other, but I didn't reply. I had nothing left to explain, nothing left to offer. By 10 o'clock the missed calls were in the double digits and my stomach was still calm, like I had finally stopped running from something that had been chasing me for years. At 11 a number I didn't recognize called. I ignored it until the voicemail alert appeared and something told me to listen. It was the property manager, Shelby, her voice even and professional. She said the usual transfer hadn't gone through and asked if I wanted to update the payment method. I could hear in her tone that she didn't know the storm she had just stepped into. I called her back with a calm I hadn't known I had. I told her there would be no more payments from my account and that any further communication should go directly to the tenants. She paused, then said okay, and that was it. No argument, no confusion, just a line being drawn clean and final. I hung up and looked around my kitchen, the same room where I had cried years ago, trying to figure out how to stretch my paycheck to cover everyone else's needs. Now that same space felt different, like it finally belonged to me. The rest of the day came in waves, the phone buzzing with messages, each one a little more frantic than the last and each one left unopened. The panic was rising. I could feel it even without reading their words, and I knew that behind those messages was a household falling apart because the support they thought they owned had been taken away. It felt surreal, watching it happen from a distance. After being the one who always stepped in to stop the bleeding, I realized they had built their lives around the idea that I would never stop helping, and now that I had the cracks were showing fast. I picked Riley up from school and she asked if we could get ice cream. I said yes, and as we sat on the curb eating in the sunlight I realized how peaceful it felt to spend money on something simple, something joyful, without the weight of someone else's overdue notice hanging over me. That night while cooking dinner I saw another message pop up from Simone, this one different, not just urgent but angry. The preview line said, "So you're just going to let us fall?" And I turned the phone face down without a second thought. For years I had carried guilt like it was my birthright, believing that if someone needed help I had to give it, believing that family meant never saying no, but that wasn't family, that was control dressed up as obligation. And the moment I stopped accepting it, everything changed. I Looked at Riley doing her homework at the table and saw how focused she was, how peaceful the room was, and I knew I had made the right choice. I wasn't responsible for their lives. I wasn't the one who left bills unpaid or let their kid grow up thinking cruelty was funny. I had done my part, more than my part, and now I was done. They could figure out their own solutions now, just like I always had. And as the night settled around us quiet and still, I felt a sense of power, not the kind that shouts or proves anything, but the kind that sits in your chest like steel, unmoving, unshakable. And for the first time in years I didn't feel afraid of the fallout, because I had already survived the worst part, and that was staying silent when everything in me knew I deserved better. The hours that followed passed like waves, slowly building with tension, not loud, not violent, but steady, each one a little stronger than the last. I kept the phone face down on the kitchen counter, ignoring the screen as it lit up again and again with their names: Logan, Simone, then Logan again. The same patterns, the same timing, panic in the morning, guilt in the evening, accusations in between. It was a cycle I knew too well, but this time I did not respond. This time I let the noise sit unanswered, like a radio playing in another room. I had spent too many years as their buffer, the one who translated chaos into calm, the one who kept them from crashing even when they were the ones steering off course. And now that silence stretched between us wide and final. Riley noticed it too. She moved carefully around the house, studying me like she was watching something unfamiliar, but she did not ask. She just stayed close, not afraid but alert. I kept myself busy, folding laundry, wiping down counters, making tea. I wasn't trying to distract myself. I was trying to feel the quiet inside my own life. For once the hours passed and still the messages came, none of them apologies, none of them acknowledging what had happened at dinner, none of them mentioning the purse or the words their son had said. Instead they went straight to logistics, straight to confusion, straight to disbelief, like money was supposed to keep flowing just because it always had. I opened one message, then closed it without reading it fully. I already knew the rhythm. I had seen it for years, the same script in different fonts, a new emergency every few days, and if I didn't respond fast enough the tone would change. It always did. It would go from "Hey, are you okay?" to "I really need you," to "I can't believe you would do this to us," and then silence until the next emergency arrived and the whole thing started over again. But this time the silence stayed longer, and I let it grow. The next morning, just after breakfast, a call came from a number I didn't recognize, and I let it go to voicemail. Then curiosity pulled me back and I listened, and it wasn't Logan or Simone, it was Shelby, the property manager, and her voice was calm, neutral. She said the rent payment hadn't gone through and she wanted to know if I had changed accounts or needed to update the billing information, and something about how casual she sounded made me realize just how deep I had gone into this arrangement. I was not even on the lease, I was not the tenant, but I had become the reliable name on the payments, and now I wasn't anymore. I called her back and told her clearly that all future rent inquiries needed to go directly to Simone and Logan. I said it slowly and firmly, and when she said thank you I knew I had just made something permanent, something irreversible, and I felt it in my chest like a breath being released. For the first time in years after I hung up, the house felt different, not quieter but more mine. It felt like a place that belonged to me, not a headquarters for everyone else's problems. The rest of the day passed in pieces. Riley worked on a school project and I answered work emails, and the phone stayed silent for a while, but by late afternoon the storm picked up again. More messages, more missed calls. The tone had shifted now, less confusion, more urgency, more edge, like they were trying to spin the wheel faster to get me back in place. But I didn't move, I didn't reply, and I didn't feel guilty. I had finally stepped out of a story I never wrote, and I was not going back. Around dinner time another message came in, this one different. The preview line caught my eye. It was not a question, it was a statement. We really needed that money, and I stared at it, feeling the old tension try to rise, but it didn't land the same way anymore. I set the phone down and walked away because I finally understood their need was not my responsibility, their emergencies were not mine to solve, and their expectations were not contracts I had signed. I made dinner with Riley and we talked about her science fair and what kind of display board she wanted, and for the first time in weeks I laughed, really laughed, and it felt strange and warm and real, like a part of me had been sleeping and finally woke up. Later that night I sat alone in the living room and thought about all the things I had ignored through the years, the bills I had paid, the nights I had cried, the holidays I had ruined trying to keep everyone else happy, the moments I had swallowed pain just to avoid an argument, and I saw them all lined up like a row of stones I had been carrying on my back, but now I was putting them down one by one. I thought again about that dinner, the purse, the laugh, the silence from my parents, the way no one stood up for me, and I let the memories sit with me, not to hurt me but to remind me I was not imagining things. I had been disrespected, I had been used, and I had finally said no. The calls slowed after that night, but I knew they were still watching, still waiting to see if I would crack, if I would call, if I would cave, and I didn't, and the silence between us became a wall, one that I did not build out of spite but out of survival. And the next morning when I made coffee and opened the curtains I felt something new, not relief, not victory, but stillness, and I knew that stillness meant something had shifted for good, and I was not afraid of what came next, because whatever it was I would face it standing tall, not bent, not begging, not small, not anymore By the next day the noise had changed. It was not just messages or missed calls anymore, it was pressure that lived in the quiet between moments that stretched across my day like invisible wires pulling at my focus. I woke early without an alarm and moved through my morning routine with an uneasy steadiness, brushing my teeth, sipping my coffee, opening my laptop to start work, but everything felt just slightly off, like the house was holding its breath. I kept my phone on silent but checked it once, just to see, and there it was, another wave of texts from Simone, 2 from Logan, 1 from a number I did not recognize, all unread, all stacked like sandbags trying to hold back a flood. I ignored them again, not because it was easy but because I had finally chosen to protect my own space even when it hurt. By mid-morning, as I answered work emails and reviewed reports, I felt it again, that soft pull of tension sitting just behind my ribs, like I was waiting for something, and I was, because I knew they would not give up easily. They never had. They had gotten used to my help, to my money, to my silence, and now that all of that was gone, they were desperate for a new way in. And sure enough, it came quietly in the form of an email from the learning center where Simone's son was enrolled. A short plain message letting me know that an account had been placed on hold due to overdue payments. The words were polite, the tone neutral, but the weight behind it hit me hard. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because the consequences had started arriving, and I felt them like a wave hitting the shore, slow but steady. The old guilt tried to rise, whispering that maybe I should fix this, just this one last thing, but I did not move. I did not reply, because I knew better now. This was not a mistake, this was a pattern, and patterns only end when you stop participating. I stood up, made tea, and let the guilt pass through me without holding it. The learning center could contact the parents, the ones who should have been responsible all along, not me. I had given enough, I had done enough, and this time I was letting the cracks show because they were never mine to patch in the first place. The messages that followed were sharper this time, not softer, not apologetic, more demanding, as if not helping was an offense on its own. One of them said, "You knew he needed that program." Another said, "I can't believe you would do this to him." And I felt the sting in those words, but it did not reach deep enough to pull me back, because I saw it for what it was, not concern, not regret, just manipulation, and I was no longer willing to play along. I closed the laptop and focused on cleaning the kitchen. Riley was at school and the house was quiet again, and I tried to hold on to that stillness like armor. My phone buzzed again, and when I looked down I saw a new name, my mother. I stared at it for a while, then let it go to voicemail. I already knew what it would say. I already knew what side she would take, because she had never been comfortable with confrontation, never liked when the surface cracked, even if the ground underneath had been broken for years. A few minutes later the voicemail came through, and I played it. My mother's voice, soft, measured, concerned. She said she had heard about the situation. She said she hoped I was okay. She said maybe this was just a misunderstanding and maybe there was a way to fix it. And I felt that familiar ache, the one that always came when she chose to see the disruption but not the history that led to it. She spoke like the problem was my silence, not the years of imbalance that forced it. She did not ask about the dinner or the purse or the words thrown at me in front of my child. She just wanted peace, even if it came at my expense. Again and again my father called not long after, his message quieter, more neutral. He said things could be worked out. He said maybe we could all talk, maybe it was not as bad as it seemed. And I stood in my hallway listening to that message and feeling something unravel, not inside me but between me and them, because I could finally see the truth. They had always preferred calm over accountability, quiet over conflict, and for years I had helped them maintain that by absorbing the damage and smiling through it, but not anymore, not after everything I had seen and felt and carried. Riley came home from school that afternoon and watched me carefully. She did not ask questions, but she knew, and I could see it in the way she hovered near me as I cooked, as I moved through the house. She sensed the shift, she felt the silence, not as tension but as change, and I knew I was doing this for her too, because I wanted her to see what boundaries looked like, not just hear the word. I wanted her to understand that love does not mean losing yourself, that being family does not mean being a doormat. I sat with her as she did homework, and when she asked if we were still going to visit Grandma this weekend, I told her gently, not this time, and she nodded slowly like she understood more than I was saying. After she went to bed I walked through the house, picking up little things, folding blankets, locking doors, checking windows, not out of fear but out of habit. And as I moved I thought about the years I had lost to other people's needs and how easy it had become for them to expect my help, like it was their right, like I owed it to them because I had given it before. I stood in the kitchen again, just like I had the night after that dinner, and looked out the window at the dark, quiet street and felt the distance between me and them grow wider. Not cruel, not cold, just honest, and I let that distance settle into my bones because it meant I was finally choosing myself, not in pieces, not with guilt, but fully and without apology. By the time the next day began I could feel a different kind of energy in the air. It was not loud, it did not announce itself, but it was there, sitting underneath every moment like static, waiting to spark. Something had shifted, not just inside me but outside too. The quiet had turned dense, like it was preparing for something to drop. I moved through the morning in a haze, making breakfast, answering a few work emails, pretending everything was normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. My body was awake, But my mind kept circling that strange tension that had crept into the house and stayed. I dropped Riley off at school and drove home feeling eyes on me even though the street was empty. When I parked in the driveway, something caught my attention, a glint on the side of my car, not a reflection, not a shadow, something sharper. I stepped closer and my stomach dropped. There on the side of the vehicle, carved deep into the paint from the front panel to the back tire, was a jagged, deliberate scratch. It was not an accident, not a key slipped out of someone's hand, not a careless child running by. It was intentional, etched with rage or spite or something even colder. I stood there in the quiet staring at the damage while the wind moved through the trees and the neighborhood stayed silent. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just looked at it, letting the message sink in. This was not about money or help or miscommunication. This was retaliation, pure and clear. Someone had crossed a line, not just with words or guilt or pressure, but with action, and they had done it without fear because they thought I would not do anything about it. They thought I would bend again, apologize again, crawl back again, and I felt something cold and firm settle into my chest, not fear but a clarity I had never had before. This was the cost of boundaries. This was the sound of a power being taken away from people who had abused it for too long, and now they wanted to remind me that I could be touched too. That silence came with consequences, but what they did not understand is that I had already paid the price for staying quiet for too long, and now I had nothing left to lose. I stepped back, took a photo of the scratch, and walked inside without reacting. The house felt colder, like it could feel what had happened too. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone, but I still did not call them. I did not accuse. I did not give them the satisfaction of a response. I knew what they wanted. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me back in the dance, spinning between guilt and panic and obligation, but I would not give them that. The photo stayed saved in my phone, a quiet kind of proof, and I went back to work like nothing had happened. Riley came home in the afternoon and I kept everything normal for her. I smiled, I helped her with math, I made dinner, but inside something was shifting, like a wall being built one stone at a time. The next morning the tension stayed. It walked beside me like a shadow while I moved through the house, while I got dressed, while I poured coffee. The silence had teeth now, and I kept waiting for it to bite. The email came shortly before noon, another piece in the unraveling. This one from Riley's school, not dramatic, not alarming, just a note from the office saying someone had called earlier trying to get her schedule, pretending to be me and failing the verification check. It hit me like a fist, not because they got information they didn't. The system worked, they were stopped, but because they tried. Someone used my name, my voice, my role as a mother to dig for something they had no right to ask for. They reached toward Riley, and that crossed a line I could not ignore anymore. This was no longer about me or money or favors. This was about safety. This was about my daughter, and no matter what had come before, that was a step too far. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the same street, the same trees, but now everything felt dangerous, like the world outside our home had turned, and I could no longer pretend it was just a bad week or just stress or just family drama. This was deliberate, and it was escalating, and the fact that they did it quietly with a phone call instead of a knock made it worse. I walked down the hall, peeked into Riley's room, saw her sitting on her bed sketching like she always did after school, and I felt something heavy press against my spine. I would not let this touch her. I would not let this reach into her world. I breathed slowly, tried to calm the fury rising inside me, and I made a decision, not one born out of anger or fear but out of certainty. I gathered every piece of documentation: the scratched car, the email from the school, the missed payment notices, the texts, the calls, the voicemails. I printed them, I organized them, I stacked them neatly and placed them in a folder, because now this was not about arguments or misunderstandings. This was about a pattern, a record, a timeline, and I needed to be ready to protect what was mine. Riley went to bed that night without noticing how tense I was, and I sat at the kitchen table with the folder beside me, the lamp above casting a soft glow on everything that had been done, everything I had tolerated, everything I was done tolerating, and I realized this was the moment when the story changed, not because I wanted revenge but because I needed peace, and peace does not come from silence. Peace comes from action, from clarity, from drawing a line and saying this is where it ends, and I was ready to draw that line. The following morning began quietly, but it carried a strange weight, like the air itself had thickened, like the day already knew something was going to happen before I did. I moved slowly through my morning routine, dressing, brushing my hair, preparing Riley's lunch, and though everything looked normal, something inside me was waiting, like a part of me was already listening for the next sound, the next knock, the next shift in the silence. I had not slept much the night before, too many thoughts running like wires under my skin: the memory of the car, the scratch, the phone call to the school, the pile of documents now neatly organized in a folder sitting in the center of the kitchen table, as if daring me to take the next step. I had been the quiet one for so long, the fixer, the helper, the one who smoothed things over and kept the family from falling apart, but I was done patching holes. I did not make. Riley came into the kitchen yawning and rubbing her eyes, and I smiled like I always did, like nothing had changed, but she watched me carefully. She was young but not unaware. She could feel things even when no one said them aloud, and I hated that this weight was something she had learned to carry. I walked her to the school gate, hugged her tight, told her to have a good day, and then I stood there for a moment watching her walk away, backpack swinging, one foot in front of the other, steady and strong, like she already knew what it meant to survive the world on your own. I drove home with the windows rolled halfway down, the cold morning air brushing against my face, and when I turned onto my street something inside me tensed again, not from fear but from certainty. Something was waiting, and it was I. Parked slowly, stepped out, and found nothing on the lawn, nothing on the car, nothing on the porch, but that did not calm me. It only confirmed that the storm had simply gone quiet, not disappeared, and that kind of quiet was more dangerous than rage. I went inside, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, opened my laptop and checked my inbox. There was an unread message from the school, this one colder, more official. It said there had been another call this morning, another attempt to ask about Riley's daily schedule, another failed verification, and this time the office had flagged it as a concern. I froze, not because I was afraid but because the escalation was no longer subtle. It was no longer about guilt or frustration or trying to pull me back. It had crossed into something else, something that touched the life of the only person I had sworn to protect at all costs. I stood up, grabbed the folder, walked to the hallway, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired but clear, and that mattered more than anything because clarity was what they feared most. Not anger, not confrontation, but the kind of clarity that does not flinch or fold or explain itself. I grabbed my keys and walked out the door. The drive to the precinct was short, but every minute felt long. I did not rehearse what I would say. I did not plan for tears or apologies. I walked in holding that folder like it weighed nothing and everything, and when I spoke to the officer at the desk I used a voice I had not used in years, steady, low, controlled. I told him what had happened. I handed over the documents, the voicemails, the emails, the photo of the car, the printout from the school. I watched him flip through it all, slowly reading, absorbing, nodding, and then he asked me if I felt safe, and I told him the truth. I said yes, in my home but not outside it. I said I was not afraid of their words, but I was aware of what came next when people like them felt power slipping away, and he nodded again and said they would take it seriously, and for the first time in a very long time I believed someone meant it. I left the building with nothing but a case number and the promise of follow-up, but I walked to my car feeling something I had not felt in years, lightness, not because everything was fixed but because I had finally chosen not to carry it all by myself. I got back home and sat in the quiet and realized that silence no longer hurt. It no longer sounded like abandonment, it sounded like protection, and I liked how that felt. I did not check my phone for messages. I did not look to see if Simone or Logan had noticed the shift yet. I focused on my work, answered emails, cooked dinner, folded laundry, and when Riley came home I let her be a child instead of a witness. We sat on the couch that night watching a movie, and I caught myself staring at her, smiling, laughing, leaning into me like she always had, and I promised myself that whatever came next I would not let it touch her. She had seen enough, she had heard enough, she had already learned what sacrifice looked like, and now it was time she learned what boundaries looked like too. After she went to bed I went outside to check the locks, the windows, the porch light, and as I stood in the doorway I looked at the night sky and felt no fear, only resolve, because now there was no going back, no pretending nothing had happened, no minimizing what they had done, the calls to the school, the scratch on the car, the public humiliation, the years of financial manipulation. They were all connected, and now they were all documented, and I had no intention of letting them disappear into silence again, not this time. The next few days passed in a strange quiet, not the calm kind but the kind that made everything feel like it was paused, on the edge of something waiting. I stuck to my routines, woke up early, made coffee, helped Riley get ready for school, answered work emails, cleaned the house, but underneath all of it was a buzzing, like the tension had not gone away, just gone underground. The messages slowed, not because they had given up but because they were recalibrating. I could feel it. Simone, Logan, even my parents, they had all gone silent at the same time, and that silence was not peace, it was strategy. They were regrouping, trying to decide how to handle the fact that I had not folded and I had not come crawling back, and the more days passed without a word from me the more uncomfortable they became. I checked my phone only when I needed to, notifications cleared without reading them, voicemails deleted without listening. I had spent too long giving their voices too much space in my mind, and now I was choosing to clear that space and use it for myself. I focused on things that grounded me, cooking meals, sweeping the porch, organizing the hall closet, folding laundry with music playing in the background. These were small things, but they were mine, and they did not cost me my peace. Riley seemed lighter too, even though I knew she felt the shift. She asked fewer questions but watched me more closely, like she was studying what strength looked like, not the loud kind but the quiet kind, the kind that shows up even when no one else claps for it. Then one morning it happened, another change, a small one but sharp. I opened an email from Riley's school, and at first it looked like a regular notice, something about a parent information update request, but buried in the message was a note from the staff saying they had received yet another phone inquiry earlier that week. The caller had once again claimed to be me and once again failed the identity verification. This time, however, the school was escalating it. They were preparing a formal report and wanted to confirm that I had not authorized any third party to contact them about my daughter. I felt the blood rush to my ears, not because I was afraid but because the truth was now undeniable. This was not a misunderstanding, this was not someone acting out of desperation, this was a deliberate invasion, a repeated intrusion that had crossed the line so many times I could no longer count. And the fact that they had moved from my finances to my daughter proved everything I needed to know about how far they were willing to go to punish me for stepping away. I replied to the school quickly, confirming that no one had permission to access Riley's information, and thanked them for their diligence, and then I sat back in my chair staring at the screen, letting the weight of the moment settle over me like fog, thick and cold and full of warning. They were trying to reach her not because they needed her but because they could not reach me. They had lost control of me, so they reached for the next closest thing, and that was a line I would not let them cross again. I walked down the hall slowly, paused at Riley's door and looked in. She was lying on her bed, headphones on, pencil moving across her sketchbook, the soft scratch of graphite on paper filling the room with a kind of peace I had worked hard to create. And I stood there breathing, letting the rage inside me melt into something clearer, sharper, quieter resolve, not the emotional kind but the kind that moves in straight lines. I went back to the kitchen, gathered the documents again, added the new email from the school, printed everything out and slipped it into the folder. It was getting thicker now, not with bitterness, but with truth, with evidence, with moments that could no longer be denied or explained away. The next few hours moved slowly. I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting to that folder and everything inside it: the phone calls, the scratches, the silence, the smirks, the accusations, the years of one-sided support, and the moment I saw clearly for the first time that none of it had ever been about love or gratitude. It had been about control, and now that control was gone and they were spiraling, I picked Riley up from school that afternoon and kept everything light. We got ice cream, sat on a bench near the park, watched the sun go down behind the trees, and talked about her project for science class. And even though I smiled and nodded and laughed with her, I never stopped listening to the quiet behind us, because the silence was still there, but now it was stretched thin like a rubber band ready to snap. I knew there would be one more move, one more attempt to test my resolve, and I would not be surprised when it came. Later that night, after Riley had gone to bed, I sat in the living room with the lights low, the folder beside me, my laptop open but untouched. I was done reacting, I was done hoping they would understand, I was done waiting for them to be decent. They had shown me who they were over and over again, and it was finally time I believed them fully, without excuse, without illusion. And that belief came with action, not just paperwork, not just boundaries, but a choice to hold them accountable for what they had done, for what they had tried to do, and for what they would no doubt try again, because people like them do not stop until you make them. The next morning arrived heavy, not with noise but with the weight of what had not yet happened. I could feel something building again, not like before, not a wave of messages or a voicemail storm, but something different, something quieter and sharper, the kind of tension that does not knock on the door but slides in through the cracks in the walls. I went through the motions of the morning in silence, made Riley's breakfast, packed her lunch, brushed her hair, kissed her forehead, but my thoughts were already somewhere else. The silence was not peace anymore, it was pressure, and I had learned to recognize the shape of it, the waiting kind, the kind that meant someone was about to test the line I had drawn. And when the first knock came, it was not loud, it was just 3 soft taps on the front door, no shouting, no confrontation, just quiet persistence. I looked through the peephole and saw no one, but I opened the door anyway because I was done being afraid. And there it was, a plain white envelope resting on the welcome mat. I picked it up slowly, heart steady, hands calm, and opened it. Right there, a printed note, no signature, no return address, just a few lines typed in bold black ink. You could have handled this privately, but now everyone knows what kind of person you really are. I read it twice, then folded the paper and went back inside. I did not cry, I did not scream, I did not shake. I just walked to the kitchen, dropped the note into the folder with everything else, and locked the front door behind me. It was not a threat, not directly, but it was a message, and it came from the same place all the others had: desperation cloaked in bitterness, masked as concern. But what they did not realize was that I had already walked through the fire and made it out whole. Their words no longer cut, they simply confirmed I was doing the right thing. I spent the rest of the morning watching the neighborhood from the window, not scared, just aware. The lines had been crossed slowly and carefully, and now there was no going back, not for me and not for them. Around noon I received a message from my mother. Her name lit up on the screen like a flare in the dark. I ignored it, but the voicemail came through anyway, and when I listened, her voice was calm, softer than usual, but full of that familiar tone, the one she used when she wanted something fixed without saying the word fix. She asked if I could come by and talk. She said she missed Riley. She said she was sure we could work something out, and the way she said it made it clear she still believed the problem was my silence, not the actions that led to it. I stood in the kitchen listening to her voice and felt a deep exhaustion, not just in my body but in my soul, because this was the pattern, always the same: avoid the truth, preserve the surface, do not upset the balance, even if it means letting someone drown quietly beneath it. I did not call her back, I did not send a message, I just sat down and stared at the folder on the table, full of evidence and history And choices I had been forced to make because no one else would protect what mattered most to me, not even the people who should have. I thought about Riley and how much she had seen, how many dinners she had sat through watching adults laugh while I went silent, how many phone calls she had overheard where my voice shook as I agreed to help again and again, how many times she had watched me shrink to make space for people who never made space for me, and I promised myself again this cycle would end. With me it would not pass down to her, it would not become her example of what family looks like, because family should never feel like fear and loyalty should never feel like losing yourself. I spent the rest of the day cleaning the house, organizing closets, doing laundry, watering the plants, doing anything that reminded me I still had control over my space and my energy. I did not check my phone again until later in the evening, and when I did, there it was, another message, this time from Logan Short. Direct, arrogant, are you proud of what you started? I read it once and closed the app without responding. Because I was not interested in his blame, I was not interested in his shame disguised as anger, I was not interested in a man who had taught his son to humiliate me and laughed while he did it. I was done giving him access to any part of me, even my attention. Riley came into the room just as I set the phone down and asked if we could watch a movie, and I said yes, and we curled up on the couch with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn, and for 2 hours we laughed and forgot about the world outside, and I knew those moments mattered more than anything else, that the most radical thing I could do now was protect our peace fiercely and without apology. Later that night, after she went to bed, I stood by the window watching the street empty and quiet, and I whispered to myself, you are allowed to walk away from what hurts you, even if they call it love, especially when they call it love. And I turned off the lights, locked the door, and went to bed knowing I had finally stopped waiting for them to change. The morning after the envelope appeared, something in me had changed, not suddenly and not loudly, but in the way a door quietly clicks shut behind you. I had done everything I could to avoid letting this become what it now was, but it had already crossed too many lines, and I could no longer tell myself it would stop on its own. I did not wake up afraid, I did not wake up shaken, I woke up steady and still and strangely calm. Riley came into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, yawning, and asking if we had cereal, and I smiled and handed her a bowl like it was just another normal school morning, and in a way it was, because even though the world outside was still shifting, the world inside our home remained safe, and that was the only thing that mattered. I walked her to the car, we talked about her project, and she laughed at a joke I barely told right, and I held on to that laugh for the rest of the drive because it reminded me what this was all really about. We arrived at her school and she gave me the usual hug, but held on just a little tighter, and I think we both knew something unspoken had passed between us. I drove home and parked slowly, watching the neighborhood like I had every day for the past week, and when I stepped out and saw nothing new, nothing broken, nothing waiting, I knew it was just a temporary pause, not the end. I went inside and sat at the table with the folder again, pulled it open and reviewed every document one more time. I laid them out like pieces of a puzzle, not because I doubted myself, but because I needed to see the pattern clearly, with no more emotion attached, just truth. The unpaid rent notices, the school emails, the scratched car, the voicemails, the message in the envelope, the call logs, all of it pointed in one direction, and that direction no longer led to me bending backwards to fix what others had broken. It led to me protecting the only piece I had left. I picked up my phone not to check their messages, but to call the officer I had spoken to before. I gave him an update, told him about the note on my porch and the continued attempts to access Riley's information, and he listened without interrupting, then asked me to come in again to file an extension to the original report. I agreed without hesitation, not out of fear but because I was done playing defense. I got dressed, pulled my hair back into a ponytail, grabbed the folder, and left the house with a kind of focus that I had not felt in years. The drive to the precinct was quiet, no music, no radio, just the sound of the tires on the road and my own breath, steady and slow. I walked and handed over the new documents and explained everything clearly, with no apology, no stammering, no second guessing, and this time I saw the officer's expression shift. He was not just taking notes, he was seeing the whole picture now, the escalation, the persistence, the targeted nature of it all. He promised to follow up more formally this time, said he would speak to someone in the department who handled repeated harassment cases, and I nodded because I had expected nothing less this time. I walked out feeling not light but firm, like a tree finally rooted after years of being bent by storms. The afternoon passed slowly. I worked, answered emails, cleaned up the living room, but my phone buzzed every hour with updates from people I had not heard from in weeks, as if the silence I had kept was finally starting to make noise somewhere else. I received a message from an old friend who said she had heard something strange about me from someone in Simone's circle, something about me being unstable, something about me losing control, something about me cutting off family out of nowhere, and I almost laughed because the words were so far from the truth, but then I felt the heat of it in my chest, not because I cared what they thought, but because I knew where it came from. It came from the people who had told me I was selfish for finally saying no. It came from the people who had drained me dry and were now mad that the well had finally run out. I replied only once and said if they want to know who I am they can come ask me directly. But they won't, because people like that only speak loudly when they think you won't answer back. I put the phone down and walked outside, stood on the porch and stared at the street, the wind blowing light through the trees, and I thought about every moment that led me here: the birthday dinner, the laugh, the splash of my purse in the water, the quiet drive home, the way Riley held my hand, the way no one defended me, the way everyone expected me to swallow it like I always had. And I realized this entire story had not been about one incident, it had been about everything that came before it and everything I had allowed in the name of love, loyalty, peace and family. And now that I had finally stepped out of that story, they were scrambling to rewrite it without me, but I would not let them. I would not give them the pen. I went back inside and made dinner, something simple for Riley and me, and we sat on the couch again, her head on my shoulder, and I knew no matter what came next, no matter how loud they got or how far they reached, I would not move, I would not break, I would not fold. I was not angry anymore, I was not grieving, I was just done. And there is a kind of freedom in being done that no apology can replace. By the time the next day arrived, I could feel something shifting again, but it was not inside the house, it was outside. It was in the way the wind moved slower than usual and the way the sky looked heavy even though there were no clouds. It was in the quiet of the street that felt less like rest and more like hiding. I went through the motions as always, woke up early, packed Riley's lunch, tied her hair into a ponytail, listened to her talk about how her art teacher had complimented her sketch, and I smiled and nodded because I wanted her to have that moment even as my thoughts were elsewhere. I dropped her off at school and she waved like everything was normal, but I could feel her eyes lingering on me for just a second longer before she turned toward the building. I watched her disappear into the crowd of backpacks and sneakers and held that image tightly as I drove home. The drive was silent, not just in sound but in feeling. There was no music, no emotion, just movement. I turned onto my street, parked slowly, and when I stepped out of the car the air felt wrong again, like the world was watching but not blinking. I walked to the front door, and that was when I saw it, a new mark on the side of the house, not big, not dramatic, just a small symbol drawn in black, something childish, almost careless, but it was not the shape that made my chest tighten, it was the intent behind it. It was a message, a quiet one, a reminder that they could still reach me without speaking. I stared at it for a long moment, then took out my phone, snapped a picture and walked inside without reacting. I printed the photo, added it to the folder, sat at the kitchen table and just breathed. I did not cry, I did not panic, I just felt the weight of it settle deeper, because this was no longer about money or boundaries or even control. This was about intrusion. It was about testing how far they could go before I broke. And I had news for them, I was already broken once, and I had rebuilt myself stronger than they ever imagined. I made coffee, sat in silence and waited, not for something dramatic but for the next move, because people like Simone and Logan do not stop. When they are ignored they escalate, when they are powerless. I opened my laptop and checked my email, and sure enough there it was, a message from the learning center Riley had attended last summer, a new notice this time saying her previous registration had been reopened with a different guardian name listed, and asking me to confirm the change. My heart dropped, not because they had succeeded but because they were trying again and again and again. Like if they knocked on every door in my life long enough, one might open by accident. I called the center, explained everything clearly, asked them to lock the account and flag it for any future attempts, and they agreed quickly, their voices nervous now, understanding the seriousness of what had been happening. And as I hung up the phone I realized this was no longer just a series of petty retaliations, this was now an active campaign, a slow deliberate reach into every corner of my life. And that realization came with a new kind of fire, the kind that does not burn hot but steady, the kind that moves through your body and builds armor. I stood up, walked to the living room and looked around, everything quiet, everything still, and I knew that peace is not something you find, it is something you fight for. And I was ready to fight, not with fists or anger or shouting but with truth and action and resolve. I went back to the precinct that afternoon, this time not with just a folder but with a timeline, with records, with names, with screenshots, with every detail mapped out like a puzzle already solved. I sat down with the same officer and showed him everything, and he listened more closely than before, nodding slowly, making notes, asking questions, and I answered them all without hesitation, without fear, because I had spent too many years second-guessing myself, and I was done with that. I was done making myself smaller to make others feel bigger. I was done pretending things were not as bad as they were. He told me they would open a formal investigation this time, that they would start contacting the institutions involved, that the scratch on the car, the calls to the school, the reopened account, the envelope, all of it mattered. And I nodded quietly because I knew that already. I left the station and got into my car and just sat there breathing, letting the weight lift one layer at a time, not all at once but enough to feel the space between my shoulders widen. I drove home, slower than usual, the world looking a little sharper, like the edges of things had returned. And when I pulled into the driveway I saw Riley's drawing taped to the window, the one with the tree and the sun and the little house, and I felt something tighten in my chest again, not fear, not pain, just purpose. That was what I was fighting for, not revenge, not validation, but a life where she could grow up without learning to flinch at every phone call or question her worth because someone else needed to feel powerful. I made dinner that night, simple, Quiet, we ate together without turning on the television, and she told me about her day, and I listened fully, completely, like nothing else existed, because for that moment nothing else did. She was safe, she was happy, and that was the only outcome I cared about anymore. The days that followed moved slowly, but underneath that slow rhythm was a growing sense of finality, not the kind that announces itself with noise, but the kind that settles into your skin and changes how you breathe. I woke up each morning to the same house, the same street, the same sky, but something inside me was different. I no longer waited for the next call or checked the porch for another envelope. I no longer scanned my car before getting in or watched the rearview mirror with suspicion. I had done what I needed to do. I had brought everything into the light. I had stopped pretending, and because of that something had shifted inside me forever. Riley could feel it too. She moved differently around the house, not nervous but aware, like she knew a storm had passed, but the wind still carried its scent. We ate dinner together more often, sat in the living room together more often. Her laughter came quicker, her questions were lighter. She no longer watched me like I might break, and I no longer pretended I was fine just to protect her from the truth. I told her I was proud of her more often, and I meant it, and she smiled wider than she had in months. The silence from Simone and Logan remained, but it no longer pressed against me like it had before. It felt like distance now, not punishment, and I understood the difference. I still did not know what they would try next, or if they would try anything at all, but I also knew it no longer mattered, because the worst had already happened and I had survived it. They had crossed every line they thought would undo me, and I was still here, standing steady and speaking clearly, and that was something they had not prepared for. They had counted on me staying quiet, staying small, staying scared, and when I did not, they lost their power, not all at once but piece by piece. I spent my mornings organizing the house again, not because it was messy but because it helped me breathe. I cleared out the closets, donated bags of things we no longer needed, cleaned out the drawers, rearranged the shelves. It felt like reclaiming something piece by piece, room by room. I put on music that filled the house with sound music. Riley danced to music I had forgotten I loved, and the house that once carried tension in every wall now held only warmth and light. I knew there was still more to come. The officer had called me again, said they were following up with the school, said there would be formal interviews, said they might ask more questions, and I said yes to all of it. I had nothing to hide, nothing to protect but my daughter, and she was already safe, and that was all I needed. I took the folder with all the documents and placed it in a fireproof box, sealed it shut and stored it away, not out of fear but out of readiness, because this time I was not waiting until it got bad. I was prepared, because people like Simone and Logan do not stop because someone asks them to. They stop when they are made to face themselves, and I knew they were not ready for that. I knew they were still somewhere trying to rewrite the story, trying to cast me as the villain, trying to convince others that I was the one who snapped. But I had stopped caring about the version they told, because the truth lived in my home and in my daughter's eyes, and in the way I could finally sleep at night without waking in panic thinking I had forgotten to pay a bill that was never mine to pay. I could finally open my bank account without seeing their names attached to it. I could finally sit in my kitchen and drink tea without waiting for the next crisis that had nothing to do with me. I was no longer their safety net, and it took them losing that to realize how much they had depended on me, not just for money but for control, for silence, for cover. And now that it was gone, they had nothing to anchor themselves to, and I refused to be that anchor ever again. One afternoon, as I was folding Riley's laundry, I found a small note in one of her hoodie pockets. It said, "Thank you for standing up for us." And my throat tightened, not because she wrote it but because she said us, not just her, not just me, us. And I realized she understood more than I thought she understood, that I had done this for both of us, that I had stopped the pattern before it could reach her, that I had shown her what it meant to draw a line and keep it there even when it hurts. And I held that note to my chest for a long time and let myself cry, not because I was weak but because I had finally stopped pretending to be invincible, and that was a strength no one had ever taught me, but I was teaching it to her every day, in every word, in every silence, and in every choice to walk away from what tried to destroy me quietly. I started to notice that the silence, which once felt like freedom, had begun to change shape again. It was no longer a break or a breath or the calm after a storm. It was turning into something watchful, not loud but heavy, and even though nothing had happened in a few days, I could feel the weight of something brewing and waiting, not out in the open but behind the edges of the days, like someone had stopped pushing because they were planning something instead. I moved through the house with a new kind of awareness. I double-checked the locks, I unplugged unnecessary devices, I kept the curtains half drawn, and every time I walked past the kitchen table I let my eyes rest on the fireproof box where the folder now lived. Inside it was everything: the scratches, the screenshots, the emails, the messages, the voice recordings, the school notices, and now also the photo of the new mark on the house and the report that had been filed with the department. Everything was documented, everything was dated, and for the first time I felt like I was not just surviving what they threw at me, I was meeting it head-on with proof and calm, and the kind of truth that cannot be shouted over. The officer called again, said they had reached out to the school, said their internal review had backed my claims, and said they would begin contacting the other institutions involved. And I thanked him, not because I was relieved but because I had not expected this level of support, and it reminded me that there were people in the world who did their jobs without asking you to bleed for them. First, Riley seemed to feel the shift too. She was more focused lately, more present. She stopped asking about the family. She stopped waiting for things to return to normal and instead settled into the life we were rebuilding together. She sketched in the evenings and played music while she cleaned her room and laughed when I tried to dance in the kitchen. Even though I knew I had no rhythm, I tried anyway, because that laughter felt like a gift every time it came, and I would have done anything to keep it in our house where it was safe. We had begun making Sunday pancakes again, something we had stopped months ago without noticing, and when I asked her if she wanted to help stir the batter, she smiled and said, "I love Sundays now," and I knew exactly what she meant. Sundays used to be full of anxiety, family brunches that ended in guilt visits that drained me emotionally, questions about why I was so quiet, why I worked so much, why I did not come around more often when everyone already knew the answers. And now Sundays were ours, just us, the smell of pancakes, the sound of music, the hum of peace without interruption. I could feel the contrast growing sharper every day between the world we had created inside our home and the pressure that still waited outside, and I knew something was coming, not because I was afraid but because people like Simone and Logan do not let go of control easily. They had already reached into Riley's school, they had already scratched my car, they had already left messages and marks and digital fingerprints, and now that those had been ignored they would find another door to knock on. And sure enough, it happened, not loudly, not directly this time. It came through Riley's art teacher, a polite note home saying someone had inquired about volunteering for the upcoming school showcase using my last name, saying they were family, saying they had lost contact with us and were hoping to reconnect through something positive. The teacher said she had not confirmed anything, just wanted to check with me before moving forward, and I sat there holding the note in my hands, feeling that old pressure again. But this time I did not crumble. I smiled and thanked her and told her the truth calmly, clearly, that no one outside of me should be allowed to access anything related to Riley's education or activities, and she nodded, understanding that what I was saying had weight and history and a reason I could not put into a single sentence. I went home and added that note to the file, added the time, added the context, added the name, and then I called the precinct again, because now this was not just about me or my property or my name, this was about my daughter again. And every time they reached for her they crossed another line they could not come back from. I explained everything, gave the timeline, gave the update, and when the officer asked if I felt like I was being followed or surveilled, I paused because I had not thought of it in those terms, but now that he had said it I could not unsee it. The eyes, the quiet, the envelope, the classroom, the new inquiries, all of it painted the picture of people trying to get close without stepping inside. And I told him no, I did not feel followed, I felt observed, and he said that mattered too, that sometimes escalation is not about sudden explosions but slow, persistent attempts to stay present in your life even after you have made it clear they are not welcome. I hung up the phone and sat in the living room with the curtains drawn, Riley on the floor painting, and I looked around our home and made a decision. I would not just defend, I would protect, I would shield, I would rise and build so high they could no longer see inside, and not just physically but emotionally. I would lock every door they thought they still had a key to, and I would do it without apology or explanation, because I owed them nothing and I owed her everything. There is a moment that comes after all the noise has died down when you finally realize you are no longer waiting for them to stop, because they already have, and that moment does not bring peace the way you think it will. It brings silence, real silence, and it is in that silence that you learn whether you were healing or simply bracing for the next hit. I felt that silence settle around me slowly like dust after something collapsed, and for the first time, I did not rush to sweep it away. I let it rest. I let it cover everything because I wanted to see what remained when the chaos was gone. Riley had stopped asking questions about them weeks ago. She no longer mentioned their names or brought up past holidays or asked when we would see them again. It was like she understood before I even said it out loud that whatever we used to have was not coming back, and that was a grief all on its own, not loud, not sharp, just slow and still and necessary. I watched her start to build new things, new routines, new confidence. She started reading more, drawing more, smiling more. She seemed lighter, like she no longer carried the weight of my silence and her own questions at the same time, and I made sure to keep it that way. I made sure to fill our home with music, with warmth, with laughter, even on the days I still felt like I was crawling out of something dark, because I never wanted her to think that strength meant never breaking. It just meant knowing how to put yourself back together again. I had one last conversation with the officer assigned to our case. He said the evidence was thorough, the timeline was clear, and that if anything else happened I had the right to press charges, formal charges, not just warnings or reports. And I thanked him, not because I wanted to take that route but because it mattered to know that I could if I needed to. It mattered to have that door open just in case they ever came knocking again. I placed the final printed copy of that call log into the fireproof box, closed it slowly and slid it into the back of the hall closet, and in that moment I felt something lift, not entirely, not all at once, but enough to take a full breath without pain. I spent that evening on the back porch watching the sun go down and listening to Riley hum a song she had made up, her voice soft and steady like a thread holding the air together, and I let myself cry for the first time in weeks, not because I was sad but because I had Survived, and survival is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like pancakes on Sunday, or notes in a hoodie pocket, or a little girl humming in the hallway when she thinks no one is listening. The next morning I found a package on the porch, not wrapped, just sealed with plain tape and no return address, and inside was my purse, the same one that had been thrown into the harbor on my birthday, soaked, stained, warped from water, but unmistakably mine. There was no note, no apology, just the object itself, returned like a dare or a mockery, or maybe both. I stared at it for a long time, holding the straps in my hands and letting all the memories come rushing back, the laughter, the splash, the silence at the table, the way I had grabbed Riley's hand and walked away without looking back. It felt like a full circle, a final move in a game I was no longer playing. I placed the purse in a plastic bag, sealed it, and drove it straight to the precinct, handed it over without ceremony. Just one more piece of evidence, one more message, one more line crossed, and the officer nodded, said he would add it to the file, and that was that. I drove home in silence, windows down, air cool and clean, like the world had finally decided to start over. And when I stepped into the house, Riley came running to show me a painting she had finished, one of us standing in the center of a quiet house with beams of light pouring in through every window, and she said, "This is what home looks like now." And I could not speak, because there it was, everything I had fought for, everything I had lost, everything I had protected and rebuilt, captured in brush strokes by a child who had seen too much and still chose beauty. I hugged her tighter than I meant to, kissed the top of her head and whispered, "You are safe now," and I meant it with every part of me. In the days that followed the return of the purse, I began to understand that closure does not always come with a clear ending. Sometimes it comes with something quieter, something that does not make a sound but settles in the bones like still water. I did not hear from Simone or Logan again, and for a while I kept expecting it, some kind of final attempt, some angry message or another unwanted appearance, but nothing came, and that silence felt different than before. It was not a waiting silence, it was a finished silence, and I could finally feel the difference. I stopped checking the windows as often. I stopped jumping when the doorbell rang. I let Riley walk to class alone again, watching her from the car with a steady gaze instead of a clenched heart, and when she waved back at me smiling, I realized we had crossed a threshold, one that could not be undone. I went home and spent that day rearranging the living room, not because it needed it, but because I wanted to see something new in the place where so much old pain had lived. I moved the couch, opened the blinds, let more light in, swapped the rug and changed the photos on the wall, and each small change felt like a statement, a soft declaration that this space belonged to us again, not to old memories, not to old harm, but to something we were still building together. I found one of Riley's old drawings tucked behind the bookcase. It was a picture of me with a cape standing in front of our house, and she had written under it, "Superhero Mom." I stared at it for a long time, letting the words settle into the parts of me that still sometimes doubted whether I had done enough, and I folded it gently and placed it in a frame and hung it on the hallway wall where we could both see it every day. I started sleeping through the night again, not all at once but more often than not, and I stopped waking up in a panic thinking I had missed a payment or forgotten a favor or ignored a message that demanded more than I could give, because that part of my life was over and I had made sure of it. I went back to the precinct one last time just to follow up, just to be certain, and they confirmed the file was closed but documented should anything ever come up again. They said I had done everything right, every step, every report, every response, and I thanked them, not because I needed the reassurance but because it mattered that someone said it out loud. I drove home feeling something close to weightless, and when I pulled into the driveway, Riley was already on the porch waving a paper in her hand. She had won second place in the school art showcase and she was glowing from the inside out. We went out to celebrate that night, not anywhere fancy, just a little diner that served milkshakes in tall glasses with whipped cream and cherries, and as she talked about her plans for her next drawing, I found myself smiling without effort, without fear, without the shadow of something waiting to fall apart. I watched her and I saw the life I had chosen, the peace I had protected, the silence I had earned, and it did not look like revenge or victory. It looked like survival and love and ordinary joy. I knew then that I had no regrets, not a single one, not about the money, not about the years, not even about the silence I had kept for so long, because it had all led to this, to a moment where I could sit across from my daughter and laugh and breathe and be completely present without a single piece of myself trapped in someone else's storm. The next morning I woke up early and stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the rooftops, and I realized that I no longer felt like I was waiting for the next thing to happen. I was no longer living in reaction to them. I was living on my own terms, and that was something they could never take back, not with words, not with money, not with silence, not with violence, not even with time. I had broken the pattern, and I had done it without becoming bitter, and I had done it without making Riley carry the cost, and that was all the closure I would ever need. There are things I used to believe about strength that no longer feel true. I used to think strength was about holding everything together no matter what, about staying silent when people crossed your boundaries, about being the one who kept the peace even when the cost was your own voice. But after everything that happened, after the scratched car, the impersonation attempts, the notes left at my door, the manipulation, the betrayal, the silence from my parents, the mocking from Simone and Logan, the twisted way they taught their child that cruelty was something to laugh at. I realized that real strength is not quiet suffering. It is not absorbing every blow just because you are capable of standing back up. It is not rescuing people who never planned to rescue you back. It is not keeping secrets for the sake of appearances. Real strength is saying no. Real strength is walking away even when the guilt screams at you to stay. Real strength is putting your child first even when it means becoming the villain in someone else's story, and that was the role they had always written for me quietly in the background, the dependable one, the helper, the one who fixes the messes and never complains, until one day I stopped playing along. And now that I have stood up for myself, now that I have drawn the line and kept it, they do not know what to do with me anymore, because people like them do not understand boundaries. They only understand control. And when they lose it, they flail, they reach, they spin stories. They weaponize silence and shame and memories, but what they do not realize is that none of those things work on someone who is done. And I am done. I am done making excuses for other people's behavior. I am done confusing loyalty with submission. I am done being the one who makes everything easier for everyone else. I look around my home now and it is different. The energy is different. The air is different. There is no tension in the corners, no unspoken anxiety floating through the rooms. Riley laughs freely now, and when she tells me stories from school, her shoulders do not flinch the way they used to when certain names came up. She draws more, paints more, sings more. She moves like someone who knows she is safe, and that safety was not handed to her. It was built, it was earned, it was fought for, and I fought for it every single day in every decision I made to protect her from the legacy of dysfunction I had inherited and had finally refused to pass down. I still have the fireproof box tucked away with all the evidence, not because I need it now but because I know what the past looks like, and I do not ever want to be caught unprepared again. But I rarely think about it now. It sits there in the dark, quiet and closed, a chapter that no longer bleeds into the present. Sometimes I wonder if they talk about me still, if they tell stories at family dinners about how I snapped or how I changed or how I abandoned them. And maybe they do. Maybe they sit around twisting the truth to make themselves feel better. Maybe they tell their version with conviction, with certainty, with the kind of rehearsed pain that sounds real to anyone who has not heard my side. But the difference now is that I no longer care. Their version does not hold any power over me. It cannot touch the peace I have built or the strength I have claimed or the child I am raising with intention and love and truth. And that is what matters. That is what I carry forward. Not the pain, not the betrayal, not the silence, but the clarity that came after, and the future that is finally mine to shape. We still make pancakes every Sunday, we still sing loudly in the car, we still dance badly in the kitchen, and we still talk about everything, even the hard things, especially the hard things, because nothing in this house is hidden anymore. Not grief, not fear, not joy, not growth. And that is the kind of home I never had but always wanted, and now I have it, not because it was given to me but because I chose it. I chose to end the cycle. I chose to rewrite the story. I chose to be the one who said this ends with me, and I would do it again 1,000 times over, because when I look at Riley and I see her light still intact, I know that everything I lost along the way was worth it. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.